to an industrial, also called the Newtonian paradigm. The Newtonian paradigm is shifting to an Einsteinian paradigm, or a technological paradigm. Where do you think India, in which wave do you think India largely is located today? India largely exists in the agrarian paradigm, somewhat in the industrial paradigm, or in the industrial wave, and somewhat in the technological wave. In fact, India is the 12th largest industrial economy. I personally don't believe India's industrial revolution has still happened. 35% of India has no electricity. Another 30% of India has less than 2 hours of electricity. They are not the statistics of an industrialized nation. Behind industrial output of Mexico and South Korea. That's where India is, not yet industrialized. Even if 59% of the GDP comes from the third wave, the number of people engaged in the third wave are not enough to comprise an ethos or a culture. So India's operating culture is agrarian. In fact, we exist in all three phases, but we exist largely in the agrarian wave. Now, if you were to take these three waves and make a kind of a pie chart, so you have 12,000 years, a large pie chart. You'll have 300 years of industrial revolution, smaller pie chart, and technological wave, which is the smallest. You sit them on the floor, and you pull it out. You have a cone. In fact, coincidentally, this cone looks very much like what the India's income economic distribution is. You have the top of the pyramid, and then you have the middle or the bottom of the pyramid. It's coincident, but extremely meaningful. We have a time axis T here. I'm not going to leave it that. I'm going to put a y-axis on this one. And in the y-axis, I'm going to plot technological evolution, meaning how has technology evolved as time has passed, right through the agrarian, industrial, post-industrial phase. If you think about it, the pace of technological change has been adequately mirrored in the speed of travel. The more technologically sophisticated we become, the faster we have traveled. So you use a bullock cart, you use a horse, you put up a bedsheet and made a sail out of it, then James Watt gave you steam, you have the steam engine, then you have the River Brothers, and now, whenever you fly from anywhere to anywhere, you're flying at least at 800 or 900 kilometers per hour, 40,000 feet above sea level. What do you think the graph will look like? If you give it thought, for most of the time the graph will run parallel in the industrial, in the agrarian wave, right? Speed of change is not shifting dramatically. As you hit the industrial wave, it begins to slope upwards because there is speed of change. And as you hit the third wave, it becomes really sharp, which means the curve looks like an exponential curve. If it's an exponential curve, in the beginning of the curve, you have hardly any change. In the agrarian wave, the pace of travel is such, there is hardly any change. Because there is no change, you tend to have the same word for yesterday as you do for tomorrow, don't you? In most Indian languages, you have the same word for yesterday as you do for tomorrow. Kal gaya tha, kal jaunga. Because yesterday is not different from tomorrow, there isn't a vocabulary to represent it. When you come to the industrial wave, the pace of slope is, it's kind of predictable. There is a certain certainty. If I were to take a ball and roll it off the stage, given the speed with which I roll the ball, given the length of the stage, you can tell me how long it will take. Ceteris paribus, no matter who rolls the ball, it takes same time. There is predictability. There is verifiability. Therefore, it is scientific. But scientific has a third component. And this is Karl Popper's principle of falsifiability. And that is, there is no truth except the extent to which it cannot be proved false. So when you were in class 7, your teacher told you rectilinear propagation of light travels in straight lines. This is the agrarian ethos. If you were to put a seed into the soil, you would notice that it becomes flower, fruit, it throws a seed, it becomes flower, fruit, throws a seed, etc. The sun rises, becomes noon, it sets, and it rises again. And again. The weather, there is summer, there is winter, there is monsoon, there is summer, there is winter, there is repetition. In an agrarian society, your operating metaphor is of cyclicality, of repetition, of renewal, of coming back. This is giving an idea of what is called cyclical time. The time is unending. If time is unending, then there is no urgency. time is unending, then there is no urgency.
Question?
Yeah, sure.
So, a little elaboration on the change that you see in India, coming in India, and what is your vision for the next 50, 100 years?
A little elaboration on change that is coming in India.
Yes, sir. Like you just mentioned Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda, and that statement that he made.
So, there's phenomenal amount of change in some sections, especially the top of the pyramid, very similar to the western part of the world. And I think the way we have our technically trained staff, the way we have people who are exposed to greater and greater parts of the outside world, our own people who are thought leaders in different parts of the world, especially in many American and British universities, the way we have begun to modernize using technology and computerize many of our processes, etc. Many of these changes are what I think we have in mind. Do we have something specific?
So specific is the
for your patience and your stamina. I see some of you been here with us since morning. We just switched the sessions a bit. We are indeed honored that Professor Stephen Cohen, who is a very well-known name in India, has chosen to be with us today. It's just a stroke of sheer good luck that I learned of his visit to India about 3 or 4 days ago, and I took a chance and requested him to be kind enough to address this audience, because if there is one person abroad who at least many of us read his views and take very seriously, and who understands not just India but Pakistan and many other issues in the subcontinent, it's Professor Stephen Cohen. I've had the privilege of interacting with him for the last more than 20 years. When I first was studying at London, and I sent my dissertation copy across to him, and he promptly responded to say that he was quite happy to see that Indian Army officers were doing the kind of work I was then in the Army. And since then we've been in touch, and when I left the Army, Professor Cohen was very kind to write a very strong recommendation in my favor, which luckily got me the Times of India Fellowship. And in subsequent years we've been in touch. I've read virtually all his books, not once but many times over. More recently he has authored the Idea of Pakistan and the Future of Pakistan. He's written the book Engaging India, and for many military officers here, he's written the one definitive document on the Indian Army, which was republished, if I remember correctly, by OUP in 1990. Professor Cohen is now at Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., writes extensively, comments, and I have had the privilege
the previous speaker used up all this territory. And, I can't do that because I'm in deep jet lag, and also a bug has bitten me. So I'm a little slow today, and it's not because of age or lack of enthusiasm. So if I sit down, you'll please understand. Let me begin by saying I first came to India in this building, at least the newer part of it, exactly 50 years and 1 month ago, as I came on a fellowship to do my research on the Indian Army after a long and bitter struggle to get a visa. And so I stayed at IIC, and it had then just opened, literally just opened. We're like one of the first people here. And so we had a great time, and every time I've come back to India, I've tried to stay here because I think it's just a marvelous institution. And the great thing about it, Maruf and others, is that you meet people here you want to meet. At General Mehta and others, it's just a fabulous place. And I don't know of another place like that, maybe in the world, where you get this exciting, interesting group of people. So let me just cut out the small talk and really go on to some specific questions. And really this is going to be based on my last book, which is on the future of India-Pakistan relations, Shooting for a Century, the India-Pakistan conundrum. Subsequent to that, I just wrote a short piece for the conference I'm here for on India and geography, with India and South Asia. And so I'll just pull together very few ideas that on that subject. And much of this is online or will be online. Let me begin by saying that as an American scholar, and again I speak for myself, one of the nice things about Brookings is that we have no position at Brookings on any issue whatsoever. Brookings supports us, encourages us, but doesn't tell us what to write. It's much freer than most universities, in a sense. We decide what we want to do, when we want to do it, and how we want to do it. So my views reflect me, myself, and I, all three of us. And not even the US government. I used to be in the government 20 years ago, and I have strong disagreement with much of American policy, even though the American Center actually supported part of this trip. So I'm speaking purely as an individual. So I think the first thing I'd like to say, it's actually pretty much the view I held 50 years ago when I came to India. So from an American point of view, at least this American point of view, the question you're addressing, the idea of India, really is the Central American interest here. And I'm looking for a metaphor, and perhaps it's a bullock cart. And bullock carts have wheels that squeak, and you pour grease on the wheel that squeaks. Well, Pakistan squeaks, China squeaks, a lot of other countries squeak. India doesn't squeak very much, so it doesn't get much attention. But that doesn't mean it's not important because it keeps the bullock cart level. Thinking of a four-wheel bullock cart, that doesn't, I've never seen one, but you get the idea. So I think that the fact that India is primarily, almost always, a self-regulating, more or less free country, more or less democratic country, which is moving forward in a direction set by the founding fathers here, is an American interest, a very important American interest. And one of the things that's disheartening is that American officials always talk about democracy being a common interest, common value, with India, common value. You hear this from Indian politicians, except during the emergency, when people kept their mouths shut about that. But I think it's actually true. The fact that India takes care of itself means that from an American point of view, from a Western point of view, from the point of view of the rest of the world, we don't worry about India. We may criticize Indian practices, human rights, and some other issues in relations with neighbors, but it's not a serious problem the way we worry about Pakistan. Clearly, Pakistan has moved from being the most allied of our allies to, and important because of its influence and power, to being important because of its weakness. It's a very squeaky wheel. So I think the first point I'd make is that Indian democracy, which is refreshed periodically, came here just as the Aam Aadmi Party triumphed in New Delhi. That's a sign of a healthy democracy. We had that in America in the last election with the, my brain is going with the Tea Party. I find much of the Tea Party policies despicable, but here were a group of young activists, middle-aged activists, not professional politicians who wanted to get involved and change America. So they did, and they're learning how the problems of America as they do. They're coming up for re-election in Congress. Some will get elected, some won't get reelected. But their ideas are influencing others. And on the Democratic side, there was the Occupy movement, which is sort of a leftist movement. And they also have had an impact on Democratic Party politics. So a healthy democracy has the inflow of new people and new ideas. Sometimes their old ideas have been reborn, and I think I see that in India. That's why the Aam Aadmi Party. And I spent a day in Andhra. Also, what's going on there in terms of the way in which the system is functioning. So, obviously, Indian democracy is imperfect, and no democracy is perfect. They're all struggling towards being better. So that's the one misstep. That's a major point I want to make. Secondly, I think there's a short-term American strategic interest in South Asia, in India. And I think this is seen by many Indians also. And I just did a review of Jaswant's book, India at Risk, is that the title? And I thought that captures perfectly the fundamental problem that India has faced from 1947 onward. And I discussed this in my own book, and I actually quote from Jaswant's book, because I thought it expresses it perfectly. When the British left India, by the time the British left India, they had created a strategic region, which they call the Indian Empire, or Indian subcontinent, whatever you want to call it. And that was really a descendant of the Mughal Empire. Both the Mughals, for the most part, and the British saw what we call South Asia as a strategic unity. And the British had created a service, called the Indian Political Service, to actually organize that diplomacy. The Indian Political Service had two wings. One wing was domestic, and they provided the advisors to the princely families, KPS, K.M. Panagar, and others. The other wing was external, and they provided residents, or whatever you want to call them, to Tibet, to the Gulf, to China, all over the place. Beijing, they were all over the place. And they were a really professional group of people, and they were drawn primarily from the army, but also from the civil service. The last one I met most recently was Jagat Mehta. Jagat had been recruited to the Indian Political Service, but by the time he was all set, he left the Indian Navy and he was all set to join the Indian Political Service, he was dissolved, abandoned. So I think he became the first or the second Indian Foreign Service officer. So this tradition was broken when India and Pakistan were partitioned. And the point is not that India has a strategic arena around it, that it has an interest. The point is that India competes with Pakistan in this arena. If you go to Pakistan, go to their libraries, talk to their generals, they have the same view of Pakistan. Now, they don't have the capabilities, and you may not like what they do to it. And of course, exporting terror here and elsewhere shouldn't be part of the game, but they see their role as a legitimate protector of South Asia as a whole. And that's how the British defined it for them, that they would be the bulwark against Islamic extremism for India. That was the theoretical plan. And let me say, before I came to India in November '63, I really can't get my dates right, I had spent a year in London interviewing every retired Indian Army general I could find. British officers, Indian officers, a few Pakistani officers, and a lot of civil servants about how they ran India, and especially how the army ran the army. And they, to a man, told me that the partition was a catastrophe from their personal and professional point of view, Auchinleck in particular. So this was the biggest tragedy of his political career, even more than getting fired by Churchill. Because from his point of view, and even some of the other generals, they had spent their careers building up the Indian military to be the army of India. And when you take that army and you cut it in half, or 1/3, 2/3, then you have a Kashmir war and so forth, and so you know the history as well as I do, then essentially what you've done is you have Indian power minus Pakistani power. That's the simple basic arithmetic. Indian power equals Indian power minus Pakistani power. And Pakistan had no problem in going out and borrowing power from the very beginning, because it knew it was outmanned by India. So the Pakistanis have been very, very skillful in their diplomacy, in going to the British first, and then to the Americans, and then finally to the Chinese, with the French along the way, for whatever technology enabled them to equalize your power. And whether it was tanks or airplanes, the dreaded F-104, the nuclear weapons, they got it. They got it, and they were willing to say or do anything to get it, because from their point of view, this was the only way to balance a much more powerful India. And I think the great failure of Indian statecraft has been, this is Jaswant's point, that for 50 years now plus, India has not been able to manage an accommodation with Pakistan. Now, many Indian friends say it doesn't matter, that it's a failing country, it's going to go away. But two things are critical. One is that this failing country, and it's clearly in big trouble, I've written 2 books about that recently, has as many nuclear weapons as you have. And it's not a trivial thing, it's a serious matter, in terms of the existence of Indians in normal state. I've had Indians tell me, well, if there's a nuclear war, India, Pakistan will be destroyed, but India will survive. That's exactly what Mao said when they first got nuclear weapons. Said, well, the West may go, but there'll always be a China because there'll be a few Chinese left to read. Well, to me, that's madness. That's really insanity, and I think that's crazy logic. But the second danger is from a failing Pakistan, not simply the loose nukes wandering around the world for sale and for rent and borrowing. You know, the Pakistanis have done that already. But also, what I would talk about is legitimate power all through the region, including the Indian Ocean. But the problem is that we don't see India as an ally. India is a friend, but not an ally. Whereas Pakistan is an ally, but not a friend. And so how do you deal with this? Recent events made a lot of Americans very unhappy. I heard on a TV report, a terrible, awful report, some Indian journalist in New York saying, "Is this how you treat an ally? Is this how you treat an ally?" Well, the foreign minister said a couple of weeks ago, "We're friends, not allies." So allies, you have to think through what an ally is. I detested the term natural ally. Well, what's an unnatural ally? It was crazy for the Americans to pick up on what the Indians said. It was a smiley, feel-good word. You know, what does it mean